I always have a Puritan book going, but I have a lot of other stuff going as well. So we're not just dependent on the Puritans, and no one, I think, is advocating that today. Um, but more people are reading the Puritans than ever before. It's not de-escalating; it's expanding, and I think it's because people want a close life with the Lord. There's a hunger out there in our secular world to have a more real, a more close life with the Lord. That's where the Puritans have their strength. So I've served three churches in my life. They've all been between 700 and 800 people. And in all three churches, when I came there, they weren't doing much reading. Now, all three churches, I'm just really passionate about getting churches to read. And I've seen this with other ministers too, where they've done this same thing. The level of holiness in the church will grow when your people are reading the Puritans. They're being searched, they're being encouraged, they're being allured, they're seeing the reality of the Christian faith as never before. And so the Puritans have a lot to offer us. Do they have their blind spots? Well, of course. Every movement has their blind spots. Slavery is an abhorrent thing. 100% against it. No matter what excuses you can use, how well the Puritans treated their slaves and brought them into their family worship and brought them to church, and many of them were converted. And you can use all those arguments, but the fact is, we are totally opposed to that. But then you need to ask yourself the question, how many Puritans had slaves? So everyone always mentions Jonathan Edwards, but scholars today are constantly debating, is Jonathan Edwards a Puritan or not? Because the 18th century, the Puritan movement is often considered to have expired in 1689. Some dated at 1704. Edwards was born in 1703 and lived to 1758. If you count him as a Puritan, yes, then he's one Puritan who had a few slaves. Um, you tell me, Kevin, what other Puritans had slaves? Very, very few. The slavery movement was largely an 18th century movement in America, and it's spilling over into 19th century when there were no Puritans, uh, unless you count Edwards as one. George Whitefield is a different stripe than a Puritan, and all the other leaders after that. And so a lot of them had slaves. Yes, there were maybe a handful of minor Puritans that had slaves. Totally wrong, totally a blind spot. And I totally condemn it. But what I don't appreciate is when people say, oh, the Puritans had slaves.
Mm-hmm.
They should say probably 1% of the Puritans had slaves. And we regret that. Maybe 2%. I don't know the exact figure. But very, very few Puritans had slaves. And so people who are trying to impugn the movement due to imperialism and those kinds of things today, they're going by other people, 19th century people, 20th century people, and people around them who are saying all kinds of things they're not aware of what they're saying that aren't really true. They're caricatures on the internet. And they're always, or not always, that's exaggeration, almost always people who haven't read the Puritans themselves.
Mm-hmm.